The shows have become insanely large. We get to put on our version of some kind of a stage show, but I think the best thing for us is we get to drag our friends along for the ride.
Parkway Drive is one of the most beloved but also most divisive bands in all of metal. And if you're not familiar, they sound a little bit like this. And for years, they were one of those bands that always made me wonder, how is this band as popular as they are? Because although their music was great, I wouldn't say that it was particularly original. I think they would probably agree with me on that. They also didn't have any kind of huge, controversial, larger-than-life personalities or costumes or anything like that. They're really just a bunch of pretty normal-looking metalcore kids from a small beach town in Australia that somehow went from literally playing in somebody's backyard to headlining some of the biggest metal festivals on the planet. And the question is, how did they do it? How did four friends from Byron Bay, Australia, end up being one of the biggest metalcore bands on the planet? And more importantly, did they actually sell out as a lot of fans accuse them of doing? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there's a link to that in the description of this video. And also, this video is brought to you by the Taiwanese emo rap artist Mars23. Here's his latest single called Not So Far Away. He's known as the Taiwanese father of emo rap, with a dual identity as both the vocalist of the rock band Trash, as well as his solo rap career. He's had several viral hits like Fail With You, Not a Rapper, and Lonely Boy. And he's about to kick off a headlining tour in North America with special guest Smart Death, who I am a very big fan of. And if you want to check him out on Spotify or YouTube, or get tickets to his tour, hit the link in the description of this video. Parkway Drive formed in early 2003 in Byron Bay, Australia, which from what I understand now is kind of bougie. There's like a Netflix show about it. But back then it was just a little surf town almost 100 miles from the nearest big city. Not exactly the kind of place that you would think of as the birthplace of a metal band like Parkway Drive. And speaking of which, if you've ever wondered where they got their name, it's very simple. They got it from the name of the street where their practice space was, a place called the Parkway House. And as they explained in their documentary, back then finding a place to play for a punk or metal band like them in a small town like Byron Bay was tough. There just weren't really any venues. And so the Parkway House was a really special place for them and their friends, and that's why they took their name from it. Their very first gig happened at the Byron Bay Youth Center, which happened to be attended by Michael Crafter from I Killed the Prom Queen, who was visiting from Adelaide.
Actually, was just like, I got to get this band on something. I've got to get this band released, I've got to get them on tour.
Which in turn led to a split release with them in 2003 and a tour across Australia. After that, they teamed up with a label called Resist Records and dropped an EP called Don't Close Your Eyes in 2004. And even though this EP is pretty rough around the edges, you can still hear a lot of potential in terms of what they would go on to be, especially taking into account how young they were when they did it. And that EP ended up doing surprisingly well. It got them a lot of initial traction in the underground metalcore scene, which even the band themselves were surprised by. And after that, they went to America to record their first full-length album, produced by none other than Adam D from Killswitch Engage, which was a huge feather in their cap because Killswitch is essentially the band that they were borrowing from the most sonically. And aside from that, at that time, it really just wasn't common at all for an Australian band to fly out to America to work with a producer of that caliber.
I chose to work with them because, well, you know, Australians talk funny, and it's always entertaining to listen to them.
And so with all of that under their belt, in September of 2005, they released their debut album, Killing With a Smile. Which ended up being surprisingly successful. It debuted on the Australian album charts at number 39 and went on to become certified gold in Australia. And I think of it as musically if Old School As I Lay Dying was a little bit more hardcore than metal, which makes sense since the guys in the band do have more of like a punk and hardcore kind of background, and that really shows on this album. And although I would argue that their later albums have objectively better songs, you just can't deny the pure, like, raw, aggressive energy of this album. And even though they've become objectively a better band, there's something to that I don't think they've ever really replicated. And back then, Parkway Drive was known for playing literally anywhere and everywhere that they could. There's tons of stories from people who say things like, I'm from this small city in Spain and bands never play here. But back in the day, Parkway came through and they played to me and 12 of my friends, and they still put on the best show I've ever seen, and because of that, I'll be a fan for life. And the life of Parkway Drive at that time was definitely not fancy. They made basically zero money and they were essentially homeless, just kind of barely making enough to get from one show to the next, and sometimes even just sleeping out on the ground. It was hard, but they were earning diehard fans one show at a time, and all that work was about to pay off. A year later, they got signed to Epitaph Records, which was a huge moment for a band like them, being from Australia, to get signed to one of the most important hardcore and punk labels of all time, and they started working on the follow-up to Killing with a Smile. And in October of 2007, they released that album, which was called Horizons. It debuted at number 6 in Australia and also went on to be certified gold. And this is when they really started to get more attention in the US and Europe. And musically, it is a massive step up from their previous album. The songs got better and catchier, mainly because they actually wrote more structured songs as opposed to the kind of riff salad approach that they had taken before. I did a podcast with Winston where he sort of joked about how they literally didn't have any choruses in the beginning. And so this is where they started to really approach songwriting as an actual craft. And so even though the album was still heavy, it was also a lot more melodic, with catchier choruses, and something that would go on to be somewhat of a trademark for them, the sing-along riff. So as great as their debut was, Horizons is considered by a lot of people to be one of the single best metalcore albums of all time. That's how big of a step up this was for Parkway. And another thing that helped them get a lot of traction at this stage in their career was how great they were live compared to their peers. Because back then, there were a lot of metalcore bands that had this reputation of sounding great in the studio, but they couldn't duplicate that live. A lot of that was because these were really young bands that went into the studio with these producers who would fix everything in the computer and make them sound amazing, but the bands themselves literally couldn't really even play their own songs. And so you would see some of those bands live and you would think, what happened? They can't play their own riffs, the vocals sound terrible, like what is this? I'm not going to name any names, but if you were around back then, I'm sure you know some of the bands I'm talking about. But with Parkway, it was the exact opposite. If anything, they sounded even better live than they did in the studio, which at the time was a massive breath of fresh air and a huge selling point for the band. And after extensive touring in support of Horizons, in March of 2010, they kicked off the recording of their third album, this time with producer Joe Barresi. That album came out later that year, and it was called Deep Blue. And once again, this was the biggest success that the band had had so far. It debuted at number 39 in Billboard in America and number 2 in Australia. And that year they also won the Album of the Year award from the Australian Recording Industry Association. Their vocalist Winston McCall said that this would be their rawest and heaviest album ever, which everybody says and almost never turns out to actually be the case. But this time, Winston was definitely not lying. Musically, I think of this as kind of like if they remade Killing with a Smile, but with better songwriting and the structure that they had on Horizons. And it's most definitely the heaviest thing that they've ever done. And to this day, it's also their only concept album. Essentially, it follows the story of a guy who just realizes that the society he lives in is completely fucked up, and how he sort of overcomes that. And if you're into that type of stuff, it's definitely worth sitting down and reading the lyrics to sort of understand the overall story that they're telling, because I personally think that Parkway Drive is definitely one of the most insightful, thoughtful bands in the genre. And this is probably a good place to talk about another reason why people love them as much as they do, which is their documentaries. 2 years after Deep Blue came out, they released a tour documentary called Home is for the Heartless, which shows their life on tour, getting interviewed, and just generally hanging out. Basically what they did is take the formula that surf and skate companies have been doing forever when they would make these tour DVDs, and Winston came from the world of boogie boarding, and so they basically said, what if we did that for our music? It works for them, maybe it'll work for us. And I think these documentaries are actually a huge part of their success. Because, like I said in the beginning, for years I always kind of wondered, why do people love this band so much? Until I watched these documentaries, and then instantly I understood. Like, you watch these DVDs and you can't help but just fall in love with this band. They just seem like a bunch of great dudes that you'd love to go surf or skate with, or just like go hang out in the aisles at Target at night, like you do when you're bored and you live in a small town. And so even though I think that they certainly would have some level of popularity based purely on their music and live show alone, at the same time, I think most of their fans would agree with me that seeing these DVDs and basically just going, these are the coolest guys ever and I want to hang out with them, I think that really helped a lot to get them where they are today.
We trekked through the jungle and were lucky enough to stumble across a long-lost native tribe.
Which brings us to their next album, Atlas, which came out in October of 2012. And with this one, they went much more melodic than their previous album. Easily the most melodic they'd taken their sound so far, with a real emphasis on catchy hooks and those sing-along riffs, with the most obvious example being the intro to Wild Eyes. And this also had some hints of what to expect from their later material that a lot of fans didn't necessarily love, but I'll talk about more of that in a minute. Overall, it's another great addition to their catalog, and a lot of fans thought this was the best thing they had ever done. And commercially, it was yet another high point for them, debuting at number 3 in Australia and number 32 on Billboard in America. But as a lot of you know, this would end up being the last album that they would ever do in this style. I told you at the beginning of this video that this band is dearly beloved by a lot of the metalcore scene, but they can also be very divisive, and this is where the divisive part comes in. In September of 2015, they released their 5th album called Ire. And this was a massive departure from anything that they had done before. For one, the album generally has an upbeat and hopeful vibe, which would be a standard for them moving forward after this point, but they also really pulled back on the technical complexity, not necessarily to the point where it's completely gone, but really only when the song calls for it. And they also pretty much completely got rid of that melodic death metal inspired At the Gates kind of riffing in favor of just more straightforward rock riffs, and went even deeper into those sing-along riffs. And they also introduced a lot of just completely new elements to their sound. For example, the part from Crushed that kind of sounds like Rage Against the Machine. It was a bold move on their part, and even though a lot of their fans didn't love it, this album took them to a whole new level. And to give you some context, up until now, the band had been on a slow but steady climb upward with every album. Each new album they came out did a little bit better than the last, and their progress was sort of slow but consistent. But with Ire, it was a whole other story. This is where they went from being essentially a fairly well-known metalcore band to being one of those giant, massive festival headliners, to the point where a lot of people started to call the band Wakencore, which is pretty funny but also true, because it seems like they headline the Wacken Festival pretty much every year. And this trend would continue with the release of their next album, Reverence, which came out in May of 2018. And this pretty much picked up where the last album left off, further evolving the sound that they had established on Ire. Although it was a little bit darker and more aggressive compared to Ire, you could almost compare it to like Ocarina of Time versus Majora's Mask. Essentially the same thing, but one has a much darker tone than the other. And this was once again their most successful release to date, debuting for the first time at number 1 in Australia, number 3 in Germany, and number 14 in the UK, while also winning them their second award for Album of the Year by the Australian Recording Industry Association. And shortly after that, in November of 2019, the band revealed a new documentary called Viva the Underdogs, to be screened worldwide for one night on January 22nd, 2020, which was pretty cool because having your documentary played in actual movie theaters, that's a pretty big deal for a metal band. And this documentary shows their entire 15-year journey from their hardcore days in Byron Bay back in 2003 to headlining festivals in 2019.
Playing Ali Pali is definitely their biggest challenge yet.
This is the biggest headline show we've ever done.
And it's also worth mentioning that as much as they emphasized their live show in the beginning, they kept on improving that live show as they got bigger and started to play those big festivals. They knew that they had gotten a lot of traction because how good they were live in the beginning, and so they kept investing more and more time, money, and energy into that show, to the point now where they have all these insane pyrotechnics, and they have their drummer play upside down because, you know, why not? But despite all the success that they were having, things were not well behind the scenes. It's the same story you've heard so many times, that more and more tension was sort of building up between members of the band, to the point that they completely called off an upcoming headlining tour, and they were even considering breaking up the band altogether. But instead of that, Parkway Drive did something that may seem kind of obvious, but rarely actually happens. They went to therapy together. And honestly, I say hats off to everybody in the band for taking that route and being so public about it. And I don't think it means that they necessarily did anything wrong. They've essentially been going with that same lineup since almost the very beginning of the band. And you think about it, spending that much time with anybody, literally living in a bus with these people for months and months and months at a time, it's inevitable that that's going to lead to this sort of conflict and built up resentment over the years, right? And a lot of people would just call it a day and burn the whole thing down out of pride and an unwilling to compromise and talk and find common ground. But they stuck it out and sorted their issues out, which I think is something we could all learn from.
Back in the early days, we were definitely best mates just having fun. But looking back, it was quite toxic. The way we would relate to each other is by pulling each other down, pointing out each other's shortcomings, and it would be like a war zone.
And out of the ashes of all of that, in September of 2022, they released their most recent album called Darker Still. Commercially, it was once again a massive success for the band, debuting at number 1 in Australia and number 5 in Germany. And this was by far their most divisive album to date. It pretty much picks up where they left off before, but going even further down that kind of melodic Wackenchor direction that they had explored before, including their softest moments to date. For example, the title track is a ballad inspired by Stairway to Heaven. But that isn't to say that they completely walked away from being heavy at all. For example, the song Soul Bleach is probably the heaviest thing they've done since Atlas. Which brings us to the last question of this video. What is their lasting impact? To me, what I really love about Parkway is that they're one of those bands that really just started out for fun, just a bunch of friends goofing around, and somehow ended up becoming one of the biggest metal bands on the planet through just really great, accessible music and an absolutely insane, unstoppable work ethic that took them all over the planet. And what they really showed is that you don't need to follow the traditional blueprint to be successful as an artist. They don't have any big, larger-than-life personalities. They don't have any gimmicks. They basically made it on their music alone. And what I find particularly inspiring is that they did all of that despite being from this tiny, out-of-the-way town in Australia, completely cut off from basically the rest of the world. But I think their biggest contribution is the fact that they proved, along with some of their peers, that in order to get to the next level, you have to take some kind of risk. I'm pretty sure that they would have done just fine if they sort of kept on doing the sound that they had on their first 4 albums. But would they have ever reached the heights that they have now if they didn't take the risk of changing their sound and taking that sort of creative leap? I don't think they would. And there's a lesson in that. For example, if you're one of these people out there right now watching this video and thinking about how much you hate your job, you have some sort of a dream, there's somewhere you want to go, but you're scared to quit that job because you don't know if things are going to work out, well, you won't know unless you try, right? And when you do take that leap, think about how hard Parkway worked in the beginning of their career. Grinding it out one show at a time, earning fans one by one by one, building that fan base that would go on to be the foundation of their career. If you put that same amount of effort into whatever it is that you want to do, I think it's pretty impossible that you're going to completely fail at that. Because to me, the biggest lesson that Parkway shows is that hard work always, always, always pays off. And I don't know when they're going to decide to hang it up. They certainly show no signs of slowing down now, even 20 years into their career. But whenever they do, I feel very confident to say that they will go down as one of the absolute best metalcore bands to ever do it. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. And I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my podcasts and videos early. I do Q&As. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.